Hello, listeners. Been wondering how you can help the show? Probably not. But here are 5 things you can do. 1. Subscribe. Support the show by clicking the subscription link in the show notes. 2. Review on iTunes, on our website, www.afraidofnothingpodcast.com, or on whatever app you listen to. 3. Donate. When you go to our website, click the cute coffee cup icon. Or in the show notes, click the subscription link. 4. Share. Sharing really is caring. Tell your friends and even your enemies to check out the show. 5. Watch. Wait a minute, it's a podcast, not a movie. Actually, it's both. Check the show notes to find out where to watch the documentary. You can also rent it on Prime Video. That's it. Oh, one last thing. Enjoy this episode. Tonight, astrophysicist and author Avi Loeb returns to talk about UAPs.
Unidentified aerial phenomena.
Abraham Avi Loeb is an Israeli-American theoretical physicist who works on astrophysics and cosmology. Avi is a Frank B. Baird Jr. professor of science at Harvard University. Coincidentally, Avi was born the same year I was, 1962, but has accomplished so much more. Avi's groundbreaking book, universe-breaking, called Extraterrestrial, the First Sign of Intelligent Life Beyond Earth, presents an evidence-based case that Oumuamua, an interstellar object that buzzed the sun in 2017, is likely a manufactured remnant of an intelligent civilization beyond our galaxy, meaning we are not alone. On June 25, 2021, new evidence in the long-awaited Pentagon UFO report substantiated that 143 out of 144 incidents reported by the military remain unidentified. How do we unlock the mystery of these sightings?
I'm sorry, Dave. I can't do that.
What role should science play? And why do I keep using this silly sound effect? Buckle in, comrade. Your world is about to change.
In a world where nothing is known, nothing is certain, reality is not real. Wake up! Be afraid of nothing. I'm Bob Heskey.
Robert.
The host with the ghost.
This is my podcast, based on my paranormal documentary, Afraid of Nothing. Each episode, we talk to people who see life and the afterlife through a different lens. Join me.
Who is this large man? And what's he doing in our bedroom?
As we lift the veil and open our minds to see beyond our eyes lie. This is Afraid of Nothing.
Hello, Avi. Thanks for coming back to the show.
Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, we last spoke a few months ago about your breakout book, Extraterrestrial, the First Sign of Intelligent Life Beyond Earth. How's the book doing?
Oh, it's doing great. It's translated to 25 languages, 28 editions. I've had 1,000 interviews over the past 6 months since the book appeared. And I mean, 1,000 is an actual number. Also, there were 25 filmmakers and producers that approached me with interest in the book, and we are about to converge with one. Things developed to a point where I might have a research project funded by some wealthy individuals that approached me. So all in all, it has been a fantastic ride. And I think the most thrilling fact about the book was that it encouraged some young people that read it to pursue a career in science. And that's what I was hoping for. A woman from Malawi wrote an email to me and said that the book is great and she's now considering a career in astronomy, and I invited her to apply to Harvard Astronomy.
That's amazing. That's great. So the film, is it going to be a documentary? And by the way, if you hear noises behind me, my dog just started playing with a squeaky toy and is running around. So just
that's okay.
It's not a UFO in the buzzing my house. It's my dog. But anyways, the film, were they thinking of making a documentary or a drama? Or well, I'm just curious.
Well, we should see. We should see how it goes, but it will be interesting no matter what.
Oh, that'd be great. We're here today to talk about the Pentagon report, the UAP report, which came out on June 25th. I'm just going to, so the audience can kind of get up to speed with us, I'll give them some quick background, and then we'll dive into your thoughts on it.
Go ahead, please.
So look, just to level set our listeners on about the Pentagon report, it was included in the $2.3 trillion omnibus spending and coronavirus relief package that was passed by Congress back in December, which seems like a lifetime ago. The report basically required that the Department of Defense and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence deliver an unclassified report on identifying flying objects to Congress within 6 months. And they just did that. The report was released on Friday, June 25th. And while it's only 9 pages long, to date, it's probably the most substantive U.S. government account of UAPs, which is the new term for UFOs. It stands for Unidentified Aerial Phenomena, ever made to the public. The Pentagon's task force preliminary assessment was based on 144 UAP reports involving observations made by military aviators between 2004 and 2021, but mostly within the last 2 years. Of the 144 reports, only one there was an explanation for. It was a deflated balloon. So 143, well over 99%, remain unexplained or unidentified. And the last 2 points regarding threats, the report said that UAP clearly pose a risk to flight safety in the increasingly crowded skies and may pose a challenge to national security, particularly if they were developed by foreign adversaries. And as for next steps, they admitted that they need to collect and analyze more information, which I think we'll talk about today. Who should be doing that, Avi? They need to consolidate reporting, and they need to develop a more efficient way of screening and processing the report. So with that said, I want to turn it to you. What did you think of the unclassified version of the Pentagon report?
Well, I think the most significant statement that was made is that some of the objects that were unidentified are real. And the reason they state that is because they detected them in infrared sensors, in optical cameras, in radar systems, and with multiple military personnel seeing them. And as a result, that means that they are not illusions, they are not smudge on the camera or malfunction of the instruments. And that's extremely important. At the same time, these objects are not identified. And so there are several possibilities. If they maneuver in ways that we cannot explain using our own technologies, of course, they could have been produced by some other humans in other nations. And that by itself is a major source of concern because we cannot recognize these technologies. And you would expect our intelligence to be sufficiently knowledgeable of what's available out there. And moreover, we would see some signatures of any advanced technologies in the consumer market or in the battlefield. And if that's the case, that the objects that appear to be real behave in ways that we do not recognize, it leaves only 2 possibilities on the table. One, that there are some natural phenomena that we haven't yet witnessed or explained, or that they are associated with extraterrestrial origin, that they represent technologies produced by other civilizations. And I should say both possibilities are exciting and interesting. And to me, the main message is that this subject should move away from the talking points of politicians or military personnel to the realm of science, because any government officials were not trained sufficiently as scientists, and they cannot really, we shouldn't expect them to interpret the data or the limited evidence we have. Instead, scientists should collect new data that would be publicly available, open to everyone, and would be analyzed in the scientific way. And One reason that a lot of the data is classified, that was not released to the public, is because it was collected with government-owned sensors that are classified. So the sensors are classified, and therefore the data is classified, because otherwise it would reveal to adversaries the kind of sensors we have. My point is, scientists can collect new data that will be open because they can get off-the-shelf instruments that are state-of-the-art, that are not necessarily installed in airplanes or Navy vessels, because they're used for scientific purposes, and they could be even better than those that were used by the military. And we can collect open data and analyze it in a transparent way. And this should be what we do next, because currently the situation is not healthy. The public is left to speculate. Many scientists just dismiss the evidence and say business as usual. Let's forget about anything that may relate to extraterrestrial origins. And I think that the correct way to move forward is not to base any statements on prejudice, but rather on evidence. There is something intriguing in the sky. Let's figure it out.
You're right. The unclassified report was 9 pages. The classified report, I don't know if it was 60 or 70 or whatever, but I mean, the message basically from the unclassified was, yes, Houston, we have a problem, but we just don't know what it is. We haven't identified it.
And these are the circumstances where scientists should lead the way, because, if society cares about it, both the general public is curious and the government doesn't know how to interpret it, then scientists can come to the rescue. And I should say this is not a philosophical question. It's actually a very practical question to identify these objects. And one way to do that is by having a high-resolution image. If we had such an image of one of the objects or many of them, then we could tell what it is. We could, in principle, read off the label. It's either made in China or made on exoplanet X. And by reading that label, we can tell the origin.
You just released an op-ed or a paper today on that. It's called Getting a Megapixel Image of a UAP. And within that document, which you just mentioned, you kind of propose leveraging a network of high-powered telescopes across the global scientific community, because there's a lot of, in many parts of the world, there are great telescopes out there that can collectively stitch together watch the sky and get the highest res image that we need. And you're right, that would help us identify it. Has anybody else thought of this besides you, or?
This is my initiative. And of course, there are existing telescope facilities that are used for astronomical surveys of the sky, but astronomers are mainly interested in very distant objects that are not moving much on the sky and have very different properties than the ones we are talking about here, the UAP. And also these facilities are in remote locations, very specific locations, and you don't have the flexibility of moving them to locations of interest. And so my initiative is actually to get completely new instruments installed in the desired locations. And by the way, this entire project should not cost a lot of money. It's affordable. I mean, relatively speaking, it costs less than the search for dark matter, that the amount of funds that we so far invested in trying to figure out the nature of most of the matter in the universe. I mean, it's quite sobering to admit that we don't know what most of the matter in the universe is. Like, there is 5 times more of this dark matter. We label it dark simply because we can't see it, or it doesn't interact with light. And it makes up about 82% of the matter in the universe. So the question is, which particles are responsible for this dark matter? And we're trying to find out. And there were some suggestions over the past several decades. And the searches were made in laboratory experiments in the sky, looking at all kinds of signatures from the sky, but nothing was found. And we spent already hundreds of millions of dollars on this search in the dark, so to speak. And that search is full of uncertainties, perhaps even more than the search for UAP, the nature of UAP. And so my point is, with much less, factor of 10 or so less investment of funds in the search for the nature of UAP, we can figure out the answer by getting a high-resolution image.
Would this be like a consortium of multiple scientific communities in many different countries, or is it mostly U.S.-based that you're proposing?
Well, the way I envision it is a team of scientists that I'm currently working on establishing. And in fact, there are several potential funders that approached me. And I think we're getting close to defining the scope of the project and also the partners in it. But it can be done just like a scientific project where one purchases the necessary instruments and constructs the infrastructure. And that includes also computers, of course. I was interviewed at CNBC and was asked by Rachel Solomon, how do I plan to celebrate UAP Day? My response was, we will probably need computers to interpret the nature of UAP. And so I plan to spend the day with my computer.
Yeah. Do you anticipate it'll be mostly private funded, or would it be government funded, or does it matter even?
Well, it does matter because the government puts a lot of restrictions on anything that its money is being used for. So, in fact, I'm aiming to get it from the private sector. And I'm quite hopeful because I have met a number of people that see eye to eye with the aim of this project.
That's excellent. Has that been posted anywhere? I saw that on your website. I saw a link and I actually read it today. Has that been picked up anywhere?
The essay was submitted to Scientific American. It usually takes about a month for it to come out.
Okay. All right, great. Now, you had, speaking of op-ed pieces, you had an opinion piece in The Hill recently titled, Time for Scientists to Identify the Unidentified in Pentagon's UFO Report. And I'm just going to quote briefly from it and ask you to add some color to it if you don't mind. From the article, the Pentagon report states, quote, a majority of UAP were registered across multiple sensors to include radar, infrared, electro-optical, weapon seekers, and visual observation, end quote. UAP could be human-made, natural atmospheric phenomena, or extraterrestrial in origin. All possibilities imply something new and interesting that we did not know before. The study of UAP should now shift from the talking points of national security administrators and politicians to the arena of science, where it will be studied by scientists rather than government or military personnel that were not trained as scientists and that did not have access to the best scientific instrumentation for collecting the data. I mean, you just kind of touched upon that. So you said you're already getting a lot of consensus and agreement on that viewpoint, correct?
Yeah, and you would never ask a plumber to bake you a cake, right? So why should we ask the military or the government to interpret the nature of UAP? This is a scientific matter, and we could simply get better data than is available right now and clear up the fog.
And do you think there is even like a small amount of nervousness that you guys identify something that is top secret or by another adversary and you guys find out before they do?
Well, it may signal a major failure of national intelligence if it turns out that these unidentified objects came from another nation and were not recognized as such. But obviously, most of the sky is not classified. Anyone can look at the sky. There are special locations where you're not allowed to put a telescope in. But otherwise, let's just look around and see what we find. It's unclear how restricted is the region where these unidentified objects appear. So that's one aspect. One should aim to look at many different locations and figure out if it's a universal phenomenon, as one would expect if the origin is extraterrestrial.
Yeah, you're right. It would be broader because a lot from that report were from over military bases or during training exercises, and that's kind of a small area when you think about it. So it would be interesting to see when you blew it out and made it wide open, just the volume and what you could get.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hi there. Do you love stories that start out ordinary, but with the turn of a universe become unforgettable, life-changing moments? So do I. I'm Ruru Sig, and I'm inviting you to the Story Chaser podcast. Join the adventure, and I promise that you will laugh, cry, and feel inspired when you listen to my narrative essays. Click the link in the notes and listen to the Story Chaser podcast, where great stories are told well.
Right. And one should keep in mind, these are the areas that are patrolled most often. So it may well reflect the fact that other regions are not being monitored as much. And those other regions are not classified at all. And one can easily monitor the sky. In fact, astronomers do it in some special occasions.
Now, what do you think? Some reports have UAPs coming up from out of the water, that ends up in the sky. Are you familiar with those at all? And would this cover that? I mean, I guess when they left the water and went into the sky, it would identify those, correct?
Yeah, I haven't had access to the actual data, but that's exactly the work of a scientist or a physicist, to look for side effects that tell you about the properties of the object. For example, if an object moves faster than the speed of sound in air, it must produce a sonic boom, a shock wave. And if it doesn't, something is really strange going on here. It may not be a real object. Similarly, when an object goes through water, there should be a splash. You should see some side effects that it produces. So as a physicist, as a scientist, one would obviously look for the side effects as well as confirmation of the reality of the object. Of course, you might imagine that the object would violate the laws of physics as we know them, but that would be even bigger news, because physicists are looking for any tiny deviation in laboratory experiments from the known laws of physics. And so far, over the past couple of decades, we haven't really identified even a tiny deviation. And most recently, there was a discussion about the magnetic moment of the muon deviating slightly from what might be predicted by very complicated theoretical calculations. So it's not at all clear, because even the theory has some uncertainty, ambiguity. This is a very tiny effect that we are scrutinizing in laboratory experiments. So if there was an object doing things that cannot be explained by the current understanding of physics, that would be big news, separate from the fact that it may have originated from an extraterrestrial origin. I'm very much looking forward to collecting also the data on the side effects, because that will tell us something interesting about the object.
Yeah, what you just said sounds a lot like Oumuamua, which it didn't act like a comet or an asteroid. It was totally different physics going on there.
Yeah, but it didn't demonstrate that any deviation from the laws of physics. It just showed that it doesn't resemble the type of rocks that we have seen previously in the solar system. So that by itself does not imply that it violates the laws of physics.
In quoting from the Hill piece again, you mentioned that Oumuamua might have been, which is interesting, retrieving data from probes that were already sprinkled on Earth at an earlier time.
Yeah, that would explain a couple of its anomalies. It did exhibit an excess push away from the sun, and since there was no cometary tail, the natural explanation for that would be to make this object very thin. And the reflection of sunlight from it implied that it most likely flat, pancake-shaped. So a flat object that is very thin, the size of a football field, could serve a different purpose than being a sail, a light sail. It could simply be a receiver, and it was tumbling so that it can collect the signals from all directions. So that's one possible interpretation of this object. There was another object detected in September 2020, just last year, by the same telescope in Hawaii, and it was given the astronomical name 2020 SO, and then it exhibited an excess push away from the sun by reflecting sunlight without a cometary tail, just the qualities of Oumuamua. But then the astronomers that discovered it realized that it actually came from Earth. It was a rocket booster from a 1966 launch to the moon. We know that it had thin walls and therefore a large area for its mass, and that's why it was pushed away from the sun by reflecting sunlight. Here is an example for an object that was artificially made, was not designed to be a light sail, but was simply thin for a different purpose. And it's quite possible that Oumuamua was thin and flat for a different purpose than being a light sail, just in order, for example, to collect data from probes that were deposited on Earth a long time ago.
So I'm trying to remember, in your book, Extraterrestrial, did that Was that covered in there, or did that light go off after kind of the UAP report? Did you consider that when you were writing the book?
No, so that light came off when I heard about the UAP report, and my thoughts are triggered by interesting evidence, by anomalous evidence. And prior to the UAP report, I was not sure that the UAP are real, that any of these objects have been detected by multiple instruments. And the UAP report stated that clearly, and also stated clearly that the same objects are not identified, meaning that they cannot be explained easily by the technologies we are familiar with here in the US. So those statements made me think again about Oumuamua.
Yeah, it makes a nice segue to my next question, is because you had another piece in Scientific American called How Humanity Can Earn the Respect of Extraterrestrials. And the subhead actually infers how that could happen. It says, favoring science over war could demonstrate our suitability to join a galactic club of civilizations. Was that tongue-in-cheek, or do you think there actually could be a galactic club of civilizations out there?
Well, I don't know if there is. In fact, I think we're most likely to be in contact with equipment that was sent by civilizations that predated us. The question of whether they are still around is open. You could send a letter in the mail, and by the time the letter arrives to its destination, you might not be alive anymore. So it's quite possible that many of these civilizations are dead. They existed billions of years ago because most of the stars formed billions of years before the sun, but they are not around. And it doesn't really matter if they sent equipment that has artificial intelligence that can make decisions on its own in an autonomous way. I should clarify that it doesn't make any sense to communicate with the sender because even the nearest star is 4 light years away. So it would take 8 years for a two-way communication signal to go there and back, even for the nearest star. And the most distant stars in the Milky Way, would take tens of thousands of years or maybe even hundreds of thousands of years for the edges of the Milky Way galaxy. What this implies is that any equipment has to be autonomous and has to have its own intelligence. And we are developing now artificial intelligence systems that are learning from experience, machine learning, and could potentially be connected to a 3D printer that would allow them to replicate themselves. So within 1 billion years, you can pretty much fill up the galaxy with such replicating artificial intelligence systems that would basically reside on almost every habitable planet in the Milky Way galaxy. So there was plenty of time to do that. And we shouldn't be surprised if we happen to find equipment surrounding us. It didn't need to start the journey a short while ago. It could have done it 1 billion years ago. And it's sufficient to have one civilization that is advanced to the level that it sends artificial intelligence systems in order to fill up the galaxy with such equipment. And therefore, I don't expect us to be in contact with other civilizations directly or join a club. But one thing that is clear to me, I was asked, how do I define an intelligent culture, an intelligent civilization? And I define it as a culture that follows the guiding principles of science, meaning cooperation and sharing of evidence-based knowledge. And this definition has two components. One is cooperation. The second is evidence-based. And if you look at human history, neither of these components is evident throughout human history. First thing is you see people fighting each other very often in wars and trying to feel superior relative to each other, wasting a lot of resources on conflicts instead of cooperation. So that's the reason why we should not be admitted yet to the club of intelligent civilizations if it exists, but even if we just hypothetically imagine it. And the second is, of course, that a lot of our convictions are not based on evidence. And you see that clearly in politics. You see how long it takes for policy to change in response to evidence. Unfortunately, I would argue that we need to be seeking for intelligence from space because we don't find it very often here on Earth.
It's funny. I don't know if it was in a Q&A or a podcast. You said one time you always look up to the sky for signs of intelligent life because you can't find it here on Earth. So I think that was great.
Yeah. And in my book, I mentioned the example of Winston Churchill that,
Yes.
wrote his essay about how exciting it would be to find life out there in 1939. And he didn't have a chance to publish his essay because he was drafted shortly afterwards to become the Prime Minister of England to fight the Nazi regime. And if you just think about the Second World War, it was a huge waste. The US wasted $4 trillion and 75 million people died in that war. That was 3% of the world population. Just compare that to the pandemic over the past year. We're talking about 75 million being killed. And 2/3 of the Jewish population in Europe was annihilated. If all of these resources were, instead of dedicated to devastation and, as a result of racist ideas, if instead they were dedicated to Churchill's vision of searching for other civilizations out there, we would have known the answer by now.
Yeah, we would have looked at Churchill as in a different light. Rather than political leader, we would have thought him as like a thought leader or whatever, right? He would have had a totally different legacy.
Exactly. But if you think about it, for humanity as a whole, how beneficial it would have been for us to figure out whether we are alone or whether there is a smarter kid on the block. And of course, we could decide not to look through the windows and shut off the curtains and say that we are the smartest and there is no one like us and we are really unique and special. But that would not make our neighbors go away. Whether we look through the window or not will not change the fact that we might have neighbors that are smarter than us.
And in other alternate outcomes, I mean, you think about all the people that perished during the war and also the extermination of the Jews, and also a lot of the Jewish people that were saved and went over to the United States, the scientists. Now those great minds were working with the U.S., so actually Germany, they lost their position as a science power by shooting themselves in the foot themselves by their own actions, by going toward fascism versus going toward science. They kind of weakened their stance overall. That's kind of a lesson for history that more people should probably look at.
Well, if you look at human history, you realize that nations that traded with each other benefited much more than nations that went into war with each other. Even though it looks tempting at first, you think that by using power, you might actually gain. You actually, in the long term, lose. And that has been the lesson throughout history. So once again, intelligence implies that cooperation is far better than war.
I think it was in Scientific American, you talked about a paper that actually was published. It was called The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge. And it was by a gentleman named Abraham Flexner. I think it was the founding director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. It was also published in 1939. What was the main message of that essay?
Yeah, so that article argued for blue sky research in the sense that very often when you're trying to resolve some fundamental puzzle out of curiosity, you end up understanding nature much better, and that can have useful applications. And let me give you a couple of examples. One is Einstein's theory of gravity. He developed it, published the papers in November 1915, and his goal was completely theoretical, trying to combine the special theory of relativity that talked about, how light and matter particles that are moving close to the speed of light interact. And then he wanted to combine that with gravity and ended up producing his general theory of relativity that could potentially apply to the universe at large. And it had purely academic goal to explain things and unify what we know about space and time and gravity and so forth. And his main insight was that gravity is not a force, but actually a property of space and time. Matter curves space and time, and the curvature of space-time tells matter how to move. That was Einstein's biggest insight, based on Galileo Galilei's realization that all objects fall the same way under gravity. And so Einstein came up with this, and then 100 years later, this is being used for our navigation systems, GPS, because without Einstein's theory, we wouldn't get the precision needed to navigate based on information exchange with satellites. So really, the exact description of Einstein's theory allows us to have a practical application. But an even more significant example is that of quantum mechanics. That was complete surprise to the world of physics, that the reality is quantum mechanical in essence, and you can't tell the location of a particle and its velocity at the same time to arbitrary precision. So in fact, everything is probabilistic. And Einstein actually resisted the possible interpretation of quantum mechanics as having spooky action at a distance, which is now called entanglement, where a system that is spread over a large region knows immediately, if you perturb it at one point, immediately the other point knows what you've done, and faster than the speed of light. So that's the nature of quantum world. And the point is that it was forced upon physicists by experiments, and now we use it practically in all the instruments that allow the two of us to communicate. It's used in the speakerphone, it's used in the computer that both of us are using. And so a lot of the quantum mechanical effects that were understood over the past century are being applied to electronic devices that we have, and we benefited greatly from that. Originally, it was a completely academic pursuit, trying to understand how atoms interact with light, that led to the development of quantum mechanics. So these are two examples, and there are many more, where first academic research that is just trying to figure out the principles of reality, how reality operates, end up producing applications that benefit society to a great extent.
Was there an example about COVID-19 that you mentioned too, regarding the vaccine and how quickly that was developed?
Oh, yeah. So here is an example where, for the first time in human history, a synthetic chemical was developed in the laboratory based on our understanding of the virus, and it produced the desired immune response in the bodies of hundreds of millions of people. And in the past, we fought viruses just by creating a weakened version of them to trigger the immune response. So it's a remarkable accomplishment of science that our understanding of how a virus operates allows us to create something completely synthetic that solves the problem. And this is the power of science. And that's why in the case of UAP, where we're faced with some puzzle that the public cares about a lot, science can come to the rescue and explain it and figure it out based on additional evidence.
I kind of smell another book coming out of this. And you just finished Extraterrestrial and you're working on a bunch of stuff. Is there a book following up, you think, coming out of what's recently happened on your radar at some point?
Well, there is a book in the making. I'm not sure yet how the baby would look like. It's being conceived right now. So I cannot tell you much about the content, but definitely the seeds for the content of the book are already planted. Yes.
Well, that's all excellent stuff, Avi. So in closing, how can people follow? I guess two questions in closing. One, what is your summer going to look like? What are you focusing on in the next couple of months regarding this? And two, how can people follow you and not only get your great book, Extraterrestrial, but also follow what you're doing?
Right. So I focus primarily on creative work these days, writing scientific papers and as commentaries on a weekly basis to Scientific American. And that's where you can find my latest thoughts on the subject that we discussed. But at the same time, I'm also starting my next book and potentially a documentary related to my first book. And in addition, most interestingly, the initiation of a project to identify the nature of UAP. That is very much on my priority list.
Are you spearheading that? Or are you part of a committee, or would you be the main guy behind it, or part of a great team of a bunch of people?
Well, I'm leading it, yes.
Okay, that's excellent. Well, Avi, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for coming back. I know you did 1,000 interviews. I was one of them back in February, and thank you for taking the time now in July 5th to come back and talk about this. So when you are ready to have your documentary, I'd love to have you back a third time if you'd grace us with your presence.
I would be delighted, and I hope to report back what the UAP are all about.
And I hope to see that picture from you too, with the when it gets set up.
Yeah, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. In my case, a picture is worth 66,000 words, the number of words in my book, Extraterrestrial. I wouldn't need to write the book if I had a high-resolution photograph.
It'd just be a meme, right?
Well, and also I think it's a key to changing the public's discourse, because nobody can deny a high-resolution image. You can easily tell the difference between a natural object and an artificial object. And if the object is artificial, I very much would like to have my hands wrapped around it, potentially playing with the technology that we find there. You know, it should be similar to the experience of playing with a cell phone that was not released yet to the public. In this case, the technology may represent our future, distant future, maybe 1,000 years from now or 1,000,000 years from now. It should be great fun for us to see something so magical, you know, because a very advanced technology could be looking like an approximation to God. It would do things that we've never imagined, and that would be quite amazing. And among the 28 editions of my book, one was published in Israel just a month ago, and they changed the image on the cover. And my literary agent said, well, this image looks more like Moses on the mountain. And I said, well, you know, the difference is that, you know, when I'm pointing my finger up, I'm talking about the promised land being elsewhere, not on Earth.
Yeah. And, you know, and in last comment I would say is thank you for being an inspiration and motivating the next wave of scientists, young scientists who are open-minded and excited about going to places where you are, where traditional scientists have been more skeptical or afraid to go to. So thank you for inspiring the next wave of scientists.
And thank you for hosting me.
You've been listening to the Afraid of Nothing podcast. Please subscribe and like us on Facebook. Until next time, stay scared.
Hey, you're still here? Great. Then why not listen to another episode? Visit afraidofnothingpodcast.com to peruse all the shows. That's afraidofnothingpodcast.com. And while you're there, click the coffee cup icon to buy me a coffee and leave a review. I'll give you a shout-out in an upcoming episode, and the world will know how swell you are.